1939, Moscow, 2025, Sweden, two buildings, almost 90 years apart. Both were told to move. In Moscow, entire buildings were shifted through the city. With people still inside, water still ran. Electricity stayed on. Telephones kept working. Nearly 90 years later, Sweden moved a 672-ton church 5 kilometers across Kiruna. But this time, the building wasn't the real problem, the ground beneath the city was. So which is harder, moving a building or moving an entire city? And why did engineers in 1939 already know how to do something that still looks impossible today? Moscow was changing fast. Old streets were being widened, and some buildings stood directly in the way. The obvious solution was demolition, but engineers chose something far more ambitious. Move the buildings instead, not small wooden houses. Massive stone buildings weighing thousands of tons. First, workers cut the building away from its foundation, then steel beams were pushed underneath it, creating a giant supporting frame. Rails were laid beneath the structure. Hydraulic jacks lifted the building just enough for it to rest on rollers and steel carriages. Then the entire building began to move, slowly, almost silently, along its new path. But the most extraordinary part was not the weight, it was what happened inside. People were still living there. Water pipes were extended. Electric cables stayed connected. Telephone lines continued to work. In some cases, residents could eat dinner, turn on the lights, make a phone call, while their entire home was changing address beneath them. One of the most famous examples was Savinskoye Podvorye, a huge ornate building on what is now Tverskaya Street. Instead of destroying it, engineers moved it roughly 50 meters away from the street line. The building survived, the residents stayed, and the street around it changed completely. And that is what makes this story remarkable. Not that Moscow moved buildings, but that it tried to move them without moving the people. Almost 90 years later, another city faced the same impossible question. Kiruna, a mining town in northern Sweden, far above the Arctic Circle. Kiruna exists because of iron ore. For more than a century, the mine has shaped the city, its jobs, its streets, and almost everything around it. But as mining went deeper, the ground above it began to deform, and eventually, parts of the old city could no longer remain where they were. So Kiruna began doing something extraordinary, not simply rebuilding, but moving parts of the city itself. Homes were relocated, historic buildings were moved, a new city center was built several kilometers away, and then came the most difficult move of all, Kiruna Church. The wooden church is one of the city's most treasured landmarks. Demolishing it and building a copy somewhere else was not the plan. Instead, engineers decided to move the entire church in one piece. It weighed 672.4 tons. It was about 40 meters wide, and its new home was 5 kilometers away. That meant the city first had to prepare a route wide enough for a church to travel down the road. For months, roads were widened. Then, on August 19, 2025, the church began to move. The journey took 2 days. And on August 20th, the church arrived beside Kiruna's new city center without major complications. A week later, even its separate bell tower followed the same road. But unlike Moscow in 1939, Kiruna is not moving buildings simply to redesign a street. It is moving because the place where the old city stood is gradually becoming incompatible with the mine beneath it, and that changes the question completely. In Moscow, engineers moved buildings so the city could change around the people. In Kiruna, the city itself has to move away. And one church is only the most visible part of a transformation that is still continuing. Two cities, two eras, two completely different reasons to do the same impossible thing. In Moscow, buildings moved so everyday life could continue around them. In Kiruna, buildings move because the city itself has to retreat. The technology changed, the machines became stronger, the calculations became more precise. But the idea stayed the same.